Welcome back to How to Reach the West Again, a podcast that aims to inspire and empower a fresh missionary encounter with Western culture. I'm your host, Brandon O'Brien. In this season 2 of the podcast, we're spending all of our time talking about cities. What are they? What does the Bible say about them? How do we plant churches in cities? What does it mean to really love and serve our cities? Our guest today is Nilza Oyola. Nilza is Executive Director of City to City Miami and Program Manager for Iglesia Floreciente, an initiative designed to equip Hispanic churches to partner with their communities in pursuing the common good as a witness to the gospel message in the transforming presence of the kingdom of God. Before we jump into that conversation, I want to take a moment to zoom out and recap where we've been in the last couple of weeks. This is the third episode in a row that we've dedicated to elaborating on the idea of contextual churches. Bishop Ray Rivera explained in episode 4 that the context all of us minister in is the context of captivity. Coming to terms with that has implications for how we operate in our cultural context. In episode 5, Robert Guerrero explained the dangers of developing metrics and strategies for ministry in the majority culture context and then trying to apply them or hold people accountable to them in other contexts. And in today's episode, Nilza Oyola describes how she helps Hispanic pastors root their ministry concretely in their local context through the community-based model of church planting, and how she helps them connect to a broader spiritual context by exposing them to the theological resources of Hispanic practitioners and thought leaders. So without further ado, here we go. We'll go ahead and jump in. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So where I'd like for us to start getting a little bit of background on your story. You have church planting experience in New York City, in the Bronx, and you're now involved in church planting in Miami. And I'm curious to hear from you. Miami and New York City are very different kinds of towns. But what is what's similar to the experience of church planting in a city like New York and a city like Miami? What are some of like urban ministry things that are true both places?
Well, first, I think you have to, I don't know whether you can answer that question without thinking about the history of both places, right? And how New York began to be New York, in the 1700s. And it was sort of like a portal for immigrants to come in, right? But they were more international immigrants. And then you got Miami, that is also a place that was sort of birthed out of immigration as well. But now you have a more distinct Latin flavor, if you will. So when it comes to those two cities, they are similar in they are both have people that transition, right? There's movement parts going on, but they are different in the people that live around, right, in the city. It's different. Miami is more multicultural, but has that Latino. 62% of it are Spanish speaking. So when it comes to language and culture, although multicultural, you have a lot of Latin Americans live here, apart from Cubans that make about 70% of the population here in Miami. So it is more rich in terms of culture when it comes to the Latino Hispanic versus New York. I think it is more international in that way. They have a strong Hispanic presence because New York, I believe, if I could get my statistical data right, it has the largest population of Latinos.
Okay.
But it is more, if I can use this term loosely, Americanized, adopted some of that culture, and versus here, the Latinidad of being a Latino in Miami is very present. So those are the differences that I can say. And because of it, the way that you plant the church in New York and the way you plant the church in here is totally different. In New York City, when it comes to church plant, it allows for sort of that community building, right? And I'm going to use that term loosely because some will argue that again, Miami has that sense of community and culture. But when you have to drive everywhere, it's less contact with people. Versus when you take a train and you're meeting people and you're getting to know people's stories, right? When you go to the bodega in the corner, especially in an urban setting, you know the people in the bodega, right? You just, or even in the local supermarket, your neighbors, you got the housing projects, and all these things are different. You have people going in bicycles, always walking, like all that at the New York City, the vision of New York City, it is different in here. And for me, kind of was like a culture shock. I thought because we were Latino, we were going to kumbaya. And brother, I tell you, I was surprised. It was just hard. So it's totally a different context when it comes. You have those similarities, but when it comes to building community and church planting, especially if you are a community church, the way to go about it is going to be totally different.
Yeah. So you are navigating some cultural differences in a move from New York City to Miami. You've church planted both places and have talked a little bit about the way those cultural contexts are different. You're also navigating another cultural difference, which is you are a woman in church planting in a field which is historically very male dominated. Can you tell me how you got started in ministry and how that kind of your beginnings in ministry as a woman in church planting? How did that go? What did that look like?
Actually, it started, if I can say that, I'm a little charismatic. We have a line of evangelists and pastors, and my grandmother was a missionary. So faith has been a strong part. Came to New York when I was 12 years old. Didn't know the language, but I had those challenges, right? I was also raised in foster care. So that impacted even the way I looked at ministry and even I looked at my relationship with God. So oftentimes I try to sort of excel just to prove, right, myself, one of being who I was, and then two, also being a woman. Always, it was present being a woman, being a challenge, and then struggling with the tension of my faith, right? With institutionalized religion, like some of the same things that we struggling today, right? And my call for ministry, and I fought it. I mean, believe me, I fought it. I didn't want to be a minister at all, but I was already doing ministry in the community in the South Bronx. That's what I did, economic development, right? But I didn't see it. I didn't link it. And it wasn't until one day, this is true story, how it happened. It was the coldest day in New York City. And this pastor, that his wife happened to work with me under my leadership, she had been inviting me to go to the church in Harlem. And they are from a black church, right? In Harlem, Methodist Church. So they invited me. Blonde hair, Hispanic, with an accent, imagine. So I was already like, I don't want to go there. But this day, the coldest day in New York City, I got up and I just went to the church. So when I go into the church, a beautiful church, I think it's 100 years old, right there in Harlem. And as I walked in, and the pastor said, well, I think I should dismiss everybody. It's too cold. The mothers of the church said, no, Pastor, God gave you a word. Give us the word. Give us the word. And then this blonde girl comes in and they all look back with their big hats and, dressed in white. And I was like, oh my God. And the pastor goes, come in, daughter. Come in, daughter. And there, his message touched me. And he was preaching about the prodigal son. And he said, come back home, come back home. And that was the door, really. And it was interesting because I didn't end up in a Latino church. I ended up in an Afro-American Black church in Harlem, in the Methodist tradition, when I come from the Pentecostal one. So imagine two different worlds. And they took me under the wing, and that's where I answered the call.
That's great. And I know, I like to think that things have improved and that certain opportunities are more available now for women in ministry in the evangelical and church planting spaces that we occupy. But I assume that there are still challenges for operating in the roles that you operate in. What do you feel like are the kind of key challenges for you in the world you're inhabiting?
I know the big elephant in the room is the theological resistance, right? But that's another podcast. Not going to argue that one. But that is real. It's very real. The difference is that in the secular now, even 500 Fortune companies have realized the value and the gifts and the talents of women and give them space. That many years ago they wouldn't. It's not a large space, but still they have recognized that the church is still not necessarily there. So as a result, and depending again of your tradition, we don't have the same positions. We might do the same functions, but our titles are different. They may not be so open to put a woman preaching on leadership. And if you are a woman pastor and you happen to, but it's denomination, and you happen to be in that position, it is still hard because it's so embedded in us and even in our culture, even in our Latino culture, right? The machismo mindset is still there. So to overcome those truly is by the grace of God that we can do it.
What do you think? You mentioned that the secular world, that the business world recognizes the unique contribution of women, even if not to the degree that they should, that they're beginning to see it. What do you think is a unique contribution that women make in the church planting conversation?
God has gifted us with resiliency, even communication skills. We tend to be more team players. I mean, these are the things that even Fortune 500 companies have researched and have made the decisions based on those because they realize that women are the ones that, okay, let's go about business. At least a great percentage of them, right? They are more sharp. They in that arena, right? In making it happen, detail oriented. They're more aggressive in terms of perhaps taking risks, knowing that if this is what I need to do to get to where I need to get, I'm gonna go ahead and do it. They're not afraid to ask. All that I think that cultivate, right, interpersonal relationships in a more lasting way, if you will, right? We really develop those relationships. We tend to be, again, highly resistant, even in the face of hardship. I mean, if you think about our makeup, right? Even when it comes to rejection, even when it comes to failure, again, we try very hard at doing things. And so I think that are our soft skills. And we have the hard skills. Women are also getting educated, right? I was like back in the days, now women have doctoral degrees. Even in the church planting world, we have women that are theologians, that are really bringing forth, right, theology and being in these spaces that predominantly have been men. And I think for the church not to begin to recognize those skills would be a detriment to the church and to those, instead of, because it can be a benefit. I always say this analogy, right? I'm not a feminist. right? So I'm not trying to be a man or anything like that. But I do think that God has given us gifts and talents. The book of Acts have prominent women, Lydia, right? Dorcas. They were there for a reason, and they even funded the ministry. So, and someone can argue the other side, right? But the truth is that they do have gifts and talents. And those gifts and talents are not specific for one person, but for the entire body of Christ and for the benefit and the edification of the body of Christ. And when you sort of silence that part, then the whole body is not benefit.
Yeah. So
if I use that analogy, right, all the body parts are needed, right? They all make the same functions, but without one, you're really not whole. And I think that's the part where maybe the church can be a little bit more open.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a really helpful way to think about it, that a lot of what you described, interpersonal relationships, taking risks, and trying to draw out the unique giftings of a variety of people and get them organized around a shared purpose. That, I mean, fundamentally, that's what we're trying to do in church planting, catalytic work in cities to try to get people working together to meet the needs of our neighborhoods. And I think it's a mistake to deprive those networks and those ecosystems of the gifts of half the people in the congregation and in the work. I want to shift in our conversation here to one of your sort of focuses in your work, which is your work with Iglesia Floreciente, which I have here a description of, that this initiative is designed to equip Hispanic churches to partner with their communities in pursuing the common good, or shalom, as a witness to the gospel message and the transforming presence of the kingdom of God, which is a beautiful vision. And there's a lot of terms in that description that we could unpack. Hopefully we'll get to all of them, but I wonder if you could maybe start for us by saying, let's start with the idea of shalom. What is that? What does shalom look like in an urban neighborhood in Miami where you're in service now?
Well, we know that shalom. What is shalom? Right? It's the peace of God. The peace of God that restores all things, all fallen things, right? We live in a fallen world, in a captive world. The shalom God is the one, right? It's that common good. So for us, when you try to visualize what shalom will be, is creating that sense of belonging, a sense of community, relationship, a shared purpose or common good, and people coming together in divine connections, if you will, to address the needs of our community, whether it is housing, employment, whether it's education, right? Health care. So when you have not one person, but you have the church building bridges with the community together, that, for me at least, is shalom.
You've mentioned the priority there of the needs of the community, the partnership of the church with the community. And it's in this definition, but in some other material, you talk about the kind of community-based model of ministry. Can you tell us what that is and how it differs from more traditional church planting?
In my own experience as a church planter, right, and being also in a traditional setting as well, and I think that both serve its purposes as many other models. I mean, you have the house church model and what are the hybrid model or mixed model, and so many other models as well. But this too specifically, in my own experience with the traditional model, has been more of like come and see versus go and see. So if I were to put it in short, come and see means that traditional model of how Allen Church will call it attractional church model, right? Come and see what God is doing in our church.
Okay, yeah.
The more traditional and in some ways the more attractional model versus the more community-based ministry model is more being sent, right? Let me go and see what's happening in the community. And based on that, right, then we're going to get together to attend, to reflect, truly reflect what the community that God has put us in there. If that is our intention, so then the gospel of Jesus can transform lives, community, but also impact that city where you at. So if that's the mission of your church, then it needs to have different type of elements. And it's based, if you will, in Isaiah 61, right? The peace, again, the shalom of God, that holistic approach. That when you bless, in order to receive a blessing, you gotta bless your city as well, right? When people were, when they were in exile, he called them to, right, to be there to bless the city, but yeah, you're in exile, right? So it is sort of that, that framework. And there are some elements that I think that are important, that are different between a more attractional, traditional model, right? With just the pastor, you got some activities going on in the church, all good, but it's mostly, let me invite people to come and join in worship with us here, so inwardly rather than outwardly, right? So, for instance, in a community more based model, you attend to the needs of the people. So that's one thing. You go and you see what's going on in my community, what are some of the needs, and how we as the church can help. You also do what we call the asset-based community development mapping, right? You want to know what is already things that are in the community that can be resources to the church. There are different pillars in a community, right? There's schools, there's government, again, there are organizations, businesses, and the church is one of them. In my opinion, it should be the strongest, but it's not the only one, right? And as a result, we need to collaborate with these other entities. So making sure that we through collaboration, understanding what God is already doing, what other type of organization, how can I come alongside of that, even including other faith bases and even other churches. It's important to understand that one church cannot do it at all together, that we need more people. Also, the fact of leadership development is another aspect within this model, right? Bringing or raising indigenous leaders from the community, from the church. Oftentimes we bring people from outside, and sometimes you have to do that. But in this model, you want to be homegrown. Also in a community ministry model, you have that servant leadership attitude, if you will, right? To give, to serve, it's part of your DNA. Even when it comes to funding, it can be more creative, right? Because oftentimes, as in church planting, you're working with a budget, it becomes hard at times. A lot of pastors are bivocational. But in this type of model, you can be creative, right? You got grant writing, you can sort of non-for-profits that can bring external revenue to the church, so you're not just heavily, right? And depending where you are, maybe the people, you can't just rely on maybe on your titles and your offerings, right? Because that might not even be something, a tradition that the people that you are trying to serve even have, right? So it can become difficult. But in this type of model, it's more community. It's looking at the resources that you have in the community. How do we come alongside of that? Also looking at the church with that same lens. What are the gifts and talents that we have within a church that can help those identified needs in the community?
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of a friend of Redeemer City who does community development work in New York City, Al Santino, who has mentioned that very often when we do spiritual gift assessments and things, the results are often talking about how the people in your congregation can serve within your congregation, but they're not always alerting you to the ways that the people in your congregation could use those gifts out there in the community. And so it sounds like you're describing both. What do we have that we can give? What exists already that we can resource, support, leverage so that we're working together to build a better neighborhood? I love it. You mentioned in some of the explanation about the way the training works for Iglesia Floreciente is that you're helping Hispanic church leaders draw on the theological and ministerial resources of the Hispanic church. And so I'm curious how, for people who may not be familiar, how would you describe the some of those resources, some of the theological and ministerial heritage that help you in the work that you're doing?
But one of the things that we try to encourage is to draw from our culture, right? From our own, and I'm going to say theology. And this way, might not be a seminary, might not be even Western. Most of it is, right? But it is based on our living experiences and culture and how that has drawn us to God. I know Shao Romero, in his book, The Brown Church, he called some of those share experiences and where we have learned theology, the grandmother theology, right? Mm-hmm. Often it is the grandmother who have taught you to come to church or forced you to come to church, or have taught you those values of compassion, right, sharing, all those things, right, and especially in the Latino context. So when it comes, and even the sense of community, family, all those things that Latinos are known for, right? We have those strong ties. So drawing first from that, from our culture. But then from our faith, movements that have happened, like the Protestant reform, right? And the way that we describe our relationship with God, our nature of God, right? That study, how that has informed us. And even how do we even honor those? A pastor, I was talking to a pastor yesterday, and she was describing it this way. Well, I spent 20 years in the Old Testament and 1 year now in the New Testament. But she said, but I have to honor the Old Testament, because in there, and this is kind of like put a picture in your mind what I'm trying to say. She said, in there, I learned to live in community, to respect even the Bible, to know the Bible. We spent so many days at church, in community. I mean, it became sort of our family. And even if out of that became also some growing pains, if it wasn't for that, I perhaps wouldn't be where I'm here today, understanding that I need to go a little bit more in the New Testament, right? Yeah. But those, you have to honor that. So we don't want to disregard that. Is how do we learn from our culture? How do we learn from our theology, our history, and how we can draw it from and apply it in what we're doing today? Because I think it's important. Our history as a Latino community is rich.
Do you find pastors who are involved in this training, do you find that they're already aware of a lot of this kind of the richness of their own heritage and tradition, and they're like glad to embrace it? Or do you find that they're surprised to find what kinds of resources exist already in the kind of Hispanic church traditions? Or how do people receive this when you talk to them about it?
Most of the time, they're like surprised. Because the truth is that if you go to seminaries, go to the seminaries now, when I went to seminary, I'm not going to mention that because I'm not. But when I did, I didn't learn about Rene Padilla. I didn't know who Justo Gonzalez was. I didn't know who are people that even in my own heritage as a Puerto Rican, a person like what's her name, Agustina Nunez. She's a well-known theologian in Puerto Rico. I didn't know because most of the information that I received good, but from a different context, it didn't speak to my culture. It wasn't my voice. It was a more Anglo voice, Western voice. So for most people, they it's not that there are too many, or maybe not accessible. We still need to access more, but because it hasn't been the norm, it brings that aha moment, and I think this is why Iglesia Floreciente has been sort of an awakening in the church that we are working with, right, in the community churches, because they can see themselves as, we got something to contribute. We have a voice, and most people want to have a voice, right? Want to talk from their experiences and their heritage and embrace that. And even the ones that might be Latinos and might be second, third generations, it's a learning experience, and they could come and appreciate their history and not knock it down, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are you seeing as fruit coming out of this training? What are the when someone has an aha and they see the value of their own heritage and they hear their own voice and they bring that into ministry, what are you seeing as the result of those things?
One, I think some of the guard and trusting issues come down. I think that when they find the place within themselves, then it gives them sort of sometimes that courage to speak. And then now they see things in a different way. Their sense of wholeness, right, in God as well, and understanding, what, I'm a child of God. I have something that I don't need to hide. I could borrow from others, but I could also stand on my own 2 feet. And then how can I embrace that now in the ministry, right? How can I, even from the pulpit, talk about my heritage and my traditions? How can my congregants can learn from that and feel also proud, but not proud in a sense, in a condescending way and overpowering way, but feel proud that God made me. I'm made in the image of God, and I have my own wishes.
What do you think, if you think in terms of a city ecosystem, in a city like Miami, where there are lots of different kinds of communities, lots of different kinds of churches and neighborhoods, what is the gift that these Hispanic churches they're kind of part of the Iglesia Floreciente training and that are influenced by these things? What is the gift that those churches offer the whole kind of church planting movement in a city?
Like I said, even in this city where 70%, especially in Miami, in the city of Miami, are Latinos or the Latino origin, and also Spanish. It is the likelihood that it is the first language. What it does is, if you will, level the platform in some ways. I'm still learning Miami culture, and even the spread of wealth is different here in New York City, and that's important. In New York City, you go to Manhattan, right? That's where we just see the wealth. In here, if you go downtown Miami, that doesn't necessarily is where the wealth is. It may look like it, right? Some of the businesses, you may have financial institutions, but it is spread out. Mm-hmm. So when churches that are Latinos, that have been there, that are connecting with the community, have the language, are empowered, then I think it brings not only that, but it brings unity also to the church, especially small churches that are the one doing the more indigenous churches working on the ground, right? That may not have all the resources, they come together. They know they're not alone. I mean, we have right now about in our incubator or church planting training about 23 leaders and representing about 12 different churches, and 9 of them are Latino led. Mm-hmm. But the other ones are not. We got Afro-American descent, we got some from the Caribbean, and we actually did it intentionally. We did a bilingual incubator. So we brought them all together. And in the beginning, the Hispanic leaders tend to be very quiet because most of the time in these spaces, they have not been given the opportunity, right, to speak or contribute. But now, in learning all the things that they're learning in Iglesia Floreciente about their heritage, about, community engagement and the tools that we have been providing them, they feel now like, yes, now I can. And the posture is different. It's totally changed. And it's not a posture to say, hey, I'm here now in the room, but to contribute. And now when they speak from that posture. And the ones that are listening are actually appreciative of them, and they are being blessed. And that is something that I have not seen before, even in New York City, if you will.
I know you're still adjusting to Miami. You're still learning the culture. You're still a student of the neighborhood. But when you imagine Miami in 10 years or 20 years or something, if churches are really committed to unity in the gospel, seeking the shalom of their neighborhoods, etc., what do you see for Miami? A vision for the future of the city, if the kinds of things you're doing now were to really take root?
We're going to see more lives transformed and communities transformed, and not just in words, right, or in theory, but actually in action. That means we're going to see more community programs. We're going to see more collaborations. I mean, I just got out of a meeting with the Miami Council, Faith-Based Council, the County Government Office, and it's a non-partisan. But here's the beauty of things, that is going to continue, right? Mm-hmm. And now they asking us to say, you know what? We want those leaders to be part of it. So I think it's going to be more connections. Communities can invest within the community rather than leaving their communities to go and get resources because the community is not providing it for them. There's going to be more opportunities to empower that community, to empower the residents, because we have done the job of equipping our leaders to engage their community, right? To go to do those asset mapping, to work with what God is working in there. So in 10 years from now, you're going to see a different gospel. It might not be your mega churches, but instead of having one big church, maybe you have 10 of those. And maybe 10 of those churches are going to come together. Maybe there are more network of churches working together for the common good. That is at least my dream and my hope. And we hope that with our trainings and with our involvement here in the city, we can bring that sense of belonging. We can bring that bridge builder between the church and the community. Maybe we can show them really what the church is about. And it's not necessarily about building the stained glass with a cross, although they are beautiful, right? Mm-hmm. That it is more than that, that the church has a part in the community and an important part in the community and in building and continue to spread the gospel.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Nilza, for being with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me.
You can learn more about Nilza's work at City to City Miami, including Iglesia Floreciente, at citytocitymiami.com. Next week, we talk with Chris Hernandez and Robert Elkin, who are both church planters and pastors themselves, but they also coach and train church planters as well. They talk about the unique challenges of city ministry and how the agencies and denominations who serve urban pastors can do so more effectively. How to Reach the West Again is a production of Redeemer City to City. This episode was produced, written, and hosted by Brandon O'Brien. Our associate producer is Braden Gregg. Redeemer City to City is a nonprofit organization co-founded by Tim Keller and supported by generous people like you. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. Consider leaving us a review and consider making a gift to support this work at redeemercitytocity.com/give.